What's up, everyone?
What's up, klimates?
Welcome to Planet of the Klimates. Planet of the Klimates is a community-organized podcast bringing you the latest information and insight into Klima. Klima is a blockchain protocol backed by carbon credits that gives people a chance to fight climate change as a collective and get rewarded for doing so. Klima sits at the intersection of blockchain, climate action, and the carbon credit market, so there's no shortage of great stuff for us to talk about. My name's Phaedrus, and I'll be your host on this adventure. I'll be joined by my good friends and co-hosts Reg and Diamond Hands as we
discuss the latest Klima news,
drop some occasional alpha,
and connect you with the biggest and brightest names currently exploring this space. So today we're chatting with Oxymoron from the core team of KlimaDAO, but let's just jump right into this. Well, we know our POTK interviews with core Klima team members like Archimedes and Dionysus have been some of our most popular episodes to date. So we're super excited to be sitting down now with another of Klima's original founders. We're joined by Oxymoron to not only shed some light on their background and work within the DAO, but also a bit of a deep dive on carbon emissions analysis, perhaps, as it relates to our project and our mission too. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Oxymoron. I know we've had you on our radar as a potential guest for some time. It's great to finally have some time to sit down and chat. We know within the core team, we have some interesting names and personalities from ancient Greek mathematicians to Roman Stoics, and you've kind of taken a pass on those historic names and the Karen Hare PFPs. I don't know, I'm just taking a stab in the dark here. When it comes to your name, some people would say that blockchain solving the climate crisis is kind of an oxymoron. So what's the story behind your name? Do you have an origin story, or do you just enjoy exploring apparent contradictions?
Yeah, I think this is a great opening question and not one that I was expecting, honestly. Archie definitely set a precedent. He was probably the first one of the team to take the pseudonym on for his office hours. So it set a trend. I think for myself, it probably comes from my main objective prior to launch with KlimaDAO. I was responsible for doing a lot of the development of the content and the communications element of our work. So I think what we're trying to do is quite complex, and properly communicating the vision was a huge piece of work. So the name Oxymoron actually came from when I was writing that very first KlimaDAO blog piece, which I think it was published in May or so, almost a year ago. And it talks about that contrast between what our economy values and what we as humans value and get joy from. So it gets into this notion that although our natural environment is fundamentally necessary for us as humans to kind of function, and it's one of our most prized assets, we're kind of actively destroying it by the way that we're set up to consume natural resources. And in this article, anyway, it got kind of high level, and I was toying with various ideas, and oxymoron was one of the words in there, one of the concepts in there. It never made the cut. The final article was a lot more prosaic, but the name kind of stuck with me, and that's where it came from. And then of course, it's actually, my first name is 0xymoron, not Oxy, which is somewhat obligatory if you're working within the Ethereum ecosystem.
0x for the crypto wallet address, yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, interesting story. Yeah, no one's asked about it, but that's where it came from, that first blog piece, when I was sitting down and thinking about that. Meanwhile, Archie was doing the office hours, and I knew I needed a pseudonym, so that was the one.
Well, that's brilliant. I'm glad we could get the scoop there for our listeners anyways. And yeah, definitely, interesting that, we've got some, interesting or provocative or meme-worthy names and personalities and stuff. And then just to realize that your name there is referencing that, that dilemma or that contradiction when we've got these economic externalities where we're kind of, that cartoon image always comes to my mind of like sawing off the branch that we're sitting on or standing on the tree. But yeah, so you talked about those early days coming up on the 1-year anniversary now, perhaps, of some of the, earliest starts of Klima. But how about we just back up a little bit before that too? What's your background? What's your journey been before Klima?
Sure. I can start right at the beginning and go chronologically. So my background is in environmental science and renewable energies. When I did my first degree, climate change was a very hot topic. So my environmental science background really went deep into climate science more than anything. Off the back of that, specializing in renewables felt like the natural next step to gain some more sort of technical and practical skills. I think I had the feeling that environmental sciences committed you to a life of academics and research, whereas the renewable sector was at the time turning into a growing sector in its own right. So I went with that, studied renewables, worked in the energy sector. I suppose my specialism was sustainable energy policy. My work experience prior to KlimaDAO was quite varied, I suppose. I did some time in academics, did some time sort of consulting and lobbying, and did some time as a policymaker. I think my interest in blockchain really came from that. Well, I guess my interest in blockchain came from two sides. First of all, investing, right? Personal investments is the gateway drug for a lot of us. I sort of got stuck in at first in 2017. But at the time, in 2017 or so, I was also working on innovation projects here in the UK. There's a lot of funding for innovation projects in the energy sector. I think our government has made it quite clear that they take innovation in the energy sector quite seriously, and also see it as an opportunity, an economic opportunity. And at the time, I was working on a variety of sort of blockchain-y projects, proof of concept stuff, early stage stuff. There's this idea in the UK around smart local energy systems. So the basic idea is that distributed renewables, really solar, can be more efficiently or more productively used if it's used locally rather than fed back into the grid to accrue a feed-in tariff. So if you can use blockchain through sort of peer-to-peer trading systems, you can, I think they called it the 4Ds, digitize, democratize, disintermediate, and decentralize the energy system, or something along those lines. So that was probably my first real introduction into the utility of blockchain. I don't think it's not really taken off. I dare say maybe they need to hire Brian or something to put some tokenomics on their local energy systems to try and get them to take off a bit. But yeah, that was the first dip into blockchain. And then I suppose for the past 3 years or so, I've been going a lot deeper into the carbon markets and the interplay with crypto. I knew that proof of work had a big footprint. I knew that the carbon markets were searching for new demand. So there was something in that. But the deeper you go and the more you learn about the interplays, the more interesting it gets. And I think that's probably kind of where KlimaDAO comes from. I think, and Archie referenced this in his podcast, right? We've all been floating around this space, learning, trying solutions here and there. And then when we came together, I suppose the idea of KlimaDAO pulled on our sort of various insights and perspectives, and KlimaDAO in a way is probably some sort of manifestation of our various experiences. And that's where we are today. So yeah, that's my story.
Yeah, that's great. And I know we had heard in those conversations with Archie and Dionysus as well too that in theory some of you could have been competitors. You kind of came together and united to solve this problem and tackle things together.
Yeah, I mean that's the beauty of crypto and DAOs and the area that we all work in as professionals, right? It's this concept of building, collaborating, plugging in where you can, searching for new opportunities, leveraging other technology stacks that other people may have developed and you can put to use for your needs. I think this is the perfect space to do it. And I think, climate change being one of the real big issues of our generation needs that kind of open, collaborative approach. We could have gone our own ways and focused on building out our own solutions. But had we done that, our impact wouldn't have been as big, I'm sure.
I wanted to just reflect on something you mentioned earlier about your experience going from academics to exploring the commercial side of things, and then also being involved in what sounds to me like you mentioned government, either as an appointment, or maybe just expand on that a little bit, and then also the contrast that with your experience in the DAO so far in terms of how the DAO stacks up to the commercial side and also the government side in terms of moving things forward.
It's an interesting question. Academics is a great place to start, I think. You learn to cut through quite complex topics and try and test your hypothesis, right? And I think that's a really valuable critical thinking skill for wherever your career takes you. I think it's definitely served me well. I think for me, being in the energy sector, the commercial space was really quite interesting over the past 10 years or so, with various things happening, new innovations spinning up. We had the solar boom, just over 10 years ago, and maybe we're in another boom, at least in the UK. They're thinking about hydrogen a lot. So there's all this market activity happening, which is great experience to get involved with that. And then the policy making side of it's totally different as well. You're a servant, aren't you? You're a servant to society when you're involved in policy making, and you're trying to figure out again these complex competing issues to try and find optimal solutions to, in the case of the energy sector and in the UK, to basically serve the market, right? That's kind of, you're trying to remove any barriers that might be in the market to help things become more efficient. So these are all quite competing domains, I would say, or not competing domains, but different domains, different ways of thinking. I think the skills that I've gained from them are all useful in the DAO. I think KlimaDAO itself is multifaceted. In some ways, we operate like a business. We want to get partnerships in. We want to scale adoption of Klima. We want to push out the Klima Infinity product. But obviously, at the same time, and it's playing out at the moment, isn't it? The kind of structure is being developed as we go. We've been speaking about this decentralization working group and how we can maximize the power of crypto and community to help us scale. But at the same time, we've also got a quite clear set of priorities that we need to focus on in the near term to help us get to where we think we need to be. So I think with some levels, the DAO is similar to a quite commercial environment, and on other levels, it's just a totally new space, a new way of operating. Got to be able to focus on the complex things and understand the complex things, and at the same time, you've got to be an active member of the DAO to have your voice on how you want this kind of new system to develop. So yeah, I think the DAO is probably, I guess it's the fourth kind of organization I've worked in, weirdly. Probably the weirdest, but probably the most fun, I would say.
So KlimaDAO has come a long way since at least the public launch. In your mind, how has KlimaDAO changed at all? Like, did you think that we would be where we are doing what we're doing here in April 2022 back in October? Or what were you surprised by in terms of the development of Klima?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on some levels, we knew what we were getting ourselves into. We knew that there was demand for this type of solution, right? A legitimate, scalable crypto carbon solution. I think in the lead up to the launch, we saw the interest in what we were doing. So I think the fact that we have established very deep liquidity on Polygon to serve the needs and the objectives of the DAO, didn't necessarily expect us to have this level of success, but it was part of the plan, if you know what I mean. And then I think what we have been less prepared for, or what has surprised me the most, has been the development of the DAO itself, right? I think we were focused on the climate solution, and we thought that a DAO was the best way to do it for various reasons. But we launched mid-October. By November, we had this separate kind of contributor server for DAO contributors forming. and that took shape very quickly. And then, we brought more and more people in, and we started really, pumping through content, pumping through policy, pumping through DAO development. And that all happened very, very quickly. I think since January, we've slowed down, haven't we? I mean, in all honesty, it's been a tricky few months for everybody, not just within crypto or DAOs. It's been hard. And so now I think the pace of the first few months is really catching up with us. I think the gravity of our work is starting to be acknowledged at various different levels. I think our community's always had a really good grasp of what it is that we're trying to do. But now I think, we're starting to engage with new audiences. And so it's a bit of a time for reflection at the moment, which is positive, and it's needed, right? You can't always go at 1,000,000 miles per hour.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking about DAOs itself, right, we understand that you are a core member of KlimaDAO itself. So maybe you can share a little bit more about like what's your role, what department are you part of, and what do you normally do on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. I think I've always had one job since day one, that job of trying to communicate what it is that we're trying to do to the community. So I kind of mentioned that in the opening question, actually. So yeah, I've been developing a lot of written content more than anything since the genesis. I would say this is something that I'm still pretty heavily involved with. A lot of my week can be getting ideas down on paper, helping shape a piece of content, whether it's on our blog or, at the moment we're trying to hit press a bit harder. So, getting succinct content out for different types of audiences. And I think related to that, and kind of as I alluded to in the previous question, we're now starting to engage with new audiences, and that requires a different tact. So whilst our community grasps it, how do we get Bloomberg to understand it? How do we get policymaker to understand it? How do we get the carbon market to understand it? So at the moment, we're thinking quite hard about our sort of comms approach in general and trying to elevate it a bit, I would say. So that's something that I'm involved in quite a lot at the moment. I think that another piece of work that I'm involved in is the sort of partnership side of things. So, I mean, of course, lead generation is always important when you're at an early stage. It could be fielding inquiries, could be jumping into someone's Discord or Twitter to try and generate something for the DAO itself. But then also kind of similar to the kind of comms piece, engaging with potentially strategic partners, whether they're in the carbon market or part of an institution, to try and, get them on board with what it is that we're building. Can it serve them commercially, or can it serve them ideologically, or those sorts of things. So a lot of my work is also the partnership side of things. I think it's probably important as a co-founder with good oversight. I think I've got pretty good oversight over the whole DAO, to really just try and pitch in where you can. I think I've got quite a deep understanding of the subject matter. So it's a case of working with people. I think, trying to share that subject matter is quite important. That subject matter knowledge is really important if we're trying to build this thing together. So how can we make sure that everyone's able to do their job as best as possible? So I think that's another sort of element, just trying to work with people. And I think that becomes more easy as we establish this kind of structure around the DAO, right? We've been a little bit hectic, and now things are formalizing a bit more. I think it becomes much easier to work on these areas.
Yeah, it feels like we've settled on a period of stability right now in terms of both the DAO and also Klima as a protocol itself. I wanted to ask about, just to back up, take a little more a higher level view here for the listeners about what we're trying to do, and just touching on the fact you mentioned your subject matter experience. Why is the carbon market better suited to be on the blockchain?
I think that maybe we need to establish the fundamentals of the carbon market, and then we can talk about why it's relevant.
Yeah.
So the carbon market itself, I guess you can split it into two halves. So you've kind of got the supply side, which is these projects across the globe which do various things, which are the benefits of which can help us in the climate fight. So you might have a renewable energy project, which is displacing fossil fuels from the grid. You might have a forest protection project, which is ensuring that the land itself isn't degraded or deforested, or a reforestation project where new trees are actually planted. So you've got these projects, and these projects can create carbon credits as long as they surpass some quite diligent requirements. They can be accredited. And then once accredited, you kind of have a carbon credit, right? And the carbon credit's held initially by the project developers, and then they can be sold into the market. And then it's at the point where they're sold into the market where I think things, or is where Klima is focused, let's say. So these carbon credits will initially be sold onto an intermediary or a broker, and then they might be sold onto a retailer or a corporate, or occasionally to an individual. So I think at this, we'll not talk about the supply side too much at the moment, because I think it gets more into perhaps personal opinion. But
it's a bit outside the scope of Klima as well. Right?
Yeah, exactly. But on the demand side, you've kind of got this system where there's not that much transparency, there's not that much data, and it's fundamentally it's quite a slow process. If I personally want to go and purchase a carbon credit, I'll have to get in touch with a retailer. There's lots of retailers online at the moment, and usually there you have to you just click, right? You're a total price taker. It's one credit for $8, one credit for $12, one credit for $15. Or if I had a manufacturing business, I could call up a broker and I could have a conversation with them and say, I need, I've got this many emissions, I need these types of credits. What have you got for me? And then they'll tell me, well, I've got these credits, and I'll say, oh, that's a bit expensive. I'll get back to you. And then I might go and call another one up, and they might tell me something different, and then another one, and I might learn something different there. And it's just this whole process, right? And what's more is these brokers who might be selling me a carbon credit didn't actually originate the carbon credits themselves. So in order for my investment into the climate to actually get to the project developers, it's kind of got to go through another step in the chain. So you've got this inefficient market, I would say, and the blockchain, and particularly DeFi, it's all about market-based solutions, right? It's in the name, decentralized finance. It's about democratizing kind of financial transactions. So I think one of the core sort of fundamentals for KlimaDAO is the protocol-owned liquidity and the automated market makers. So we own liquidity in sushi swap pools, and that means that the reality is, once these carbon credits are bridged onto the blockchain, they can be directly traded in pools rather than the liquidity itself being held by a broker or a retailer. And I think the minute that you can move the assets themselves into liquid and transparent pools, you can then start to transact with these pools at the market equilibrium, right? The market itself is pricing the cost of carbon, or the cost of a carbon credit. And I think that's objectively a better situation than this other kind of heavily intermediated approach. So I think the blockchain itself provides that really elegant solution. And I think KlimaDAO's role of providing the liquidity is really important. And I guess just to close the loop, the kind of impact that KlimaDAO has had is that through these incentive mechanisms, we've made brokers or project developers or whoever holds carbon credits want to bring them onto the blockchain. And so I think that incentive, at the moment, we're kind of seeing this mass migration, if you like, of live carbon credits in the legacy system to live carbon credits on the blockchain. And so I think Klima's role in incentivizing that migration shouldn't be understated. And it's something really important that we're doing at the moment. But I think as the market establishes itself, and as it is understood to be a legitimate and useful solution for the carbon market itself, I think yeah, we'll see these things play out, right? More certainty for future demand, more options to sell into the appropriate pool for the credits that you might hold, and directly interface with the market. That maximizes the amount of climate finance that goes to the project developer compared with other players in the market. So yeah, some interesting things that are playing out right in front of our eyes at the moment.
For sure. So perhaps to loop things into some timely questions and some timely discussion and debate that's been had across crypto Twitter, and lots of discussion about not just the footprint or emissions that are tied to blockchain writ large or tied to Bitcoin, but specifically, there's been some criticism out there, perhaps with our friend there, Digiconomist, some criticism of whether or not the proof of stake approach that we're using on Polygon, and Klima deliberately launched on Polygon for that, low GHG footprint approach through proof of stake. So there's been that criticism out there, but I know we have a new blog post with emissions analysis done with our Klima Infinity partner, Offsetra. Would you be able to walk us through a little bit about, what this criticism is, or like how are we demonstrating the true efficiency of the Polygon network and the proof of stake approach?
Sure. I think it makes sense to start with, I guess, the fundamentals of the analysis in that case. The emissions analysis of Polygon consists of two elements, right? There's the proof of stake itself. So Polygon's proof of stake network, it incentivizes validators to secure the blockchain through incentives. A validator, is a computer, is connected to the power supply. So there's an emissions associated with the electricity consumed for the validation activities. They're usually on, most if not all of the time. So it adds up. And then there's the separate element of the dependency of Polygon as a EVM compatible blockchain on Ethereum. So it, intermittently make sure that everything's matching up between Polygon transactions with Ethereum mainnet. So there's this interface with Ethereum. Ethereum is proof of work itself. So therefore, it seems fair that Polygon should be responsible for the proportionate amount of emissions based on the amount that interfaces with Ethereum. I guess there's also another element to the proof of work dependency, which is the fact that people bridge tokens from Ethereum to Polygon, right? Maybe they've been in Ethereum or something on Ethereum for many years, and they see this great project called KlimaDAO, and they think, oh, great, I'd love to get involved in this, and so they need to bridge some of their assets over to enable market activity on Polygon to happen. So there's these two kind of pieces, proof of stake and proof of work. Proof of stake is, of course, relatively lightweight. It's a computer. It's not free to run your computer all the time. You'll have a hefty energy bill, I guess, if you leave it on all month, but it's not going to be massive. Whereas proof of work is, by all accounts, it's intensive, right? The intensity of proof of work, is internalized into Ethereum itself. If you go onto Ethereum and you try and do a transaction, I know, sell some Ethereum or something, it takes a while and it costs a bit because of the complexity and the heavy lifting of proof of work. So because of this intensity of proof of work, it's got that high carbon footprint. And so the analysis considers, it essentially adds the proof of stake emissions with the proof of work emissions. I think as you point out, there's this other kind of less well explored principle here of, should other things which are to some degree related with Polygon be attributed to Polygon's carbon accounts. So I think Matic L1, the Matic token, so Polygon's native token, which is active on Ethereum, is very active on Ethereum. You look at the gas allocated to Matic on Ethereum, it's millions. millions of gas has been used for. Like, well, because that's Polygon's native token, but it's active on Ethereum, should Polygon take responsibility for it? So checkpointing and bridging, you could probably equate to Scope 3 emissions, right? Ethereum's almost providing a service for Polygon. It needs the liquidity and it needs to make sure that the network is secure. Whereas with Matic on L1, it's activity for an Ethereum user to do something useful, invest or trade or whatever. I think it's an Offset's position on this was, look, because that's not directly bringing any benefits to Polygon, although it's the Matic token, so it's got the same name and such. That doesn't mean that those emissions should be associated with Polygon. And then Digiconomist's view is, a lot more sort of aggressive, and no, it's the Matic token, and therefore Polygon are responsible for it. And I think this kind of gets into the whole issue with crypto carbon accounting. There's some pretty, let's say, undebatable fundamentals. Validators have an energy consumption, mining rigs have an energy consumption. Well, you can define that energy consumption relatively easy. But I mean, it's harder to define the energy consumption of a mining rig compared to the validator, but it can be done. You can allocate the responsibility of emissions relatively easily by looking at transactions or gas consumption. But what's they're like fundamental principles, but these other kind of more philosophical discussion points around the edges. There is no standard. There is kind of no agreed best practice. So we get into these debates. I mean, ultimately, I would say it's a useful debate, right? This is crypto carbon accounting has probably been happening for about 2 years. We've gone from zero knowledge or limited knowledge to this being a live debate playing out on Twitter. Various organizations are interested in it. They're asking questions. They're getting in touch with the carbon accountants, etc. So I think ultimately it's a good debate to be had, but we do need to come together at some point and establish best practices.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's great. I would just like to, for our listeners there, you've kind of drawn the analogy there with, you're talking about Matic's interaction with Ethereum layer 1. And just for our listeners to pause and reflect, I think you kind of called that scope 3. So I know out there in traditional, greenhouse gas emissions accounting, they've got scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Could you perhaps just at a very high level kind of explain what that means? Is that like primary, secondary, and tertiary emissions? Is that what we're really talking about here? Or?
Sure. So scope 1 essentially is emissions associated with assets that are owned or controlled by an organization. So, for example, a boiler could be the source of scope 1 emissions. The reason being, you would have gas supplied to your boiler, and then you would combust that boiler, the gas in the boiler, to do something useful for you on site. So those emissions happen on site. And that's slightly different to scope 2 emissions, which comes from typically the generation of kind of purchased electricity for your heating and cooling systems. The kind of distinction being that if you, with scope 1 emissions, when you kind of ship that gas onto your site and you're combusting it there, so the emissions should be allocated there. With electricity, it's slightly different. Your electricity is generated in power stations or wind farms or solar farms, and then the electricity is the actual useful stuff. You just consume it on site to do something good or something that you need. So there's distinction made there between fuels combusted within a controlled asset and electricity brought in to do something useful for you. It's just distinguishing between the actual location of the generation, I suppose. And then scope 3 includes all other sort of indirect emissions that could occur within the value chain. So that could be upstream or downstream. These are really well established guidelines. I think, there's still some questions around scope 3. But what we're seeing at the moment is it's quite difficult to just, pick up those principles and then just shove them on top of crypto or blockchains and kind of, state anything absolute about how relevant they are. I think you could viably consider validators as scope 2 emissions, right? Because the network is incentivizing activity from a computer. The computer uses electricity, so it's directly, facilitating activity. I think you could say that the checkpointing and bridging, although it's done on Ethereum, it's a fundamental service to Polygon. So, similar to that definition of scope 3, where it's, associated value chain emissions. Well, that seems like a fair analogy. But can you say this asset, this Matic token, can you then say all other incarnations of it should be attributable to Polygon? I don't know. Let's see. It will be interesting to see how this debate evolves. And the more relevant this becomes, the more relevant crypto becomes, Ethereum or Polygon becomes, the more people will be trying to figure this one out. If a blockchain network provides some infrastructure service for, a FTSE 100 company, that FTSE 100 company is going to be saying to the blockchain network, well, look, you're considered within our scope 3 emissions. What are your emissions and what are you doing about it? And so you get this cascading effect down the supply chain where everyone's implicated and everyone needs to figure out their carbon emissions. And I think crypto is just kind of working through this problem at the moment. I think my final comment on this, which I think is important actually, is, and this happens a lot in the climate space, people kind of take shots at each other. Your accounting's not good enough, your action's not good enough, your carbon credit's not good enough, your investment's not good enough. And I think that's kind of counterproductive. I think it makes, whether it's an organization or an individual, it makes them feel defensive. It doesn't make them see it as an opportunity or a challenge they need to overcome. It somehow makes it personal. It somehow makes it reactive. And I think, when we engage with these conversations, we should be solution orientated. And if we think someone's undercalculated their emissions, or they've not used the right kind of carbon credit or something like that, we should, it should be a question of education, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say, and not kind of throwing shade or trying to, point score, because it's not useful given, the task that everyone on this call has kind of set themselves up to try and solve.
But speaking to, for example, some of the coverage we've had in the traditional media, I mean, we've been in the Wall Street Journal in their print edition. We've been in different, news outlets. Most recently in Bloomberg, there was an article published, and it was critical of Klima, actually, saying that, by sweeping the floor of these low quality carbon credits, we're kicking up a lot of dust, and that we're encouraging people to put out low quality carbon credits to take advantage of this. And a lot of us felt that it was perhaps an uninformed take, perhaps inaccurate. What were your thoughts when you first read that article in Bloomberg?
I mean, first of all, I would say it's a bit disappointing to see it come out the way it did. I'd agree. I don't think it really came across as a deep dive article, weighing the pros and cons of what we're doing. I don't think it even took the time to get to grips with our big ideas for the voluntary carbon market. It seems that it was heavily influenced by an article put out by another organization, who I guess I won't name, but that other article really came out firing with some kind of preconceived ideas of what we're doing. But because this other article didn't challenge its own assumptions or understanding of KlimaDAO, this kind of secondhand, and I think it's fair to say it's like superficially researched analysis. I mean, they didn't talk to us, for example, which would be their primary research activity. This kind of secondhand perspective was taken on by Bloomberg. So, we can be a bit annoyed about it, but I guess this kind of feeds into what I was saying earlier. We probably need to look closer to home, right? If Bloomberg are being led by someone else's hot take rather than taking the time to dive into our work and impact, I guess we need to step up, right? We're clearly relevant. They've covered us. We've captured over 17 million tons of carbon credits. So there's a talking point here. So if we've not done well enough to engage with them, maybe we need to be thinking about how, again, taking this super complex idea that, maybe journalists are shying away from the complexity here. What's an AMM? What's compounding carbon? What are all these these concepts? I can't even get my head around them. Then we need to think about that. And I've stated earlier in this podcast that I've been responsible for the past 9, 10, or maybe 12 months now, kind of taking a lead a lot on a lot of these communications elements. I suppose the buck stops with me to a degree there, and need to think about how we elevate it. So yeah, we can be annoyed, or we can be humbled, and kind of keep trying to just push forwards based on those principles of honesty, openness, and using kind of data to prove ourselves.
Well, I don't think we can be too critical. I love that attitude of saying, look inwards before casting outwards in terms of blame and frustration. I think that's perfect. A great attitude to have in terms of development. And that's what's got us to this point, frankly, this iterative development and evolution of not only, our communication strategy, but if you look back, the communications have always been, honest and trying to be as accurate as possible, and setting out this vision for something. So there will never be a satisfaction of everyone out there, and people will come in with preconceived notion. But again, I think the engagement is key here, whether it's maybe slightly negative on the surface. People who read that may decide to do their own research, may look up the Klima website and kind of dive in and say, oh, I think that was a little bit misguided. So, I hate to say the old, any publicity is good publicity, but I think the engagement is what's key at this stage of our development.
I agree fundamentally. And perhaps to your earlier point about, the engagement with the carbon markets, we're potentially looking at engaging with policymakers and such. That's kind of the real prize, right? Legitimacy is what we want to establish. And I think maybe that's a good kind of thing to play with, to actually come back and go a bit deeper into what that article was trying to say. Bearing in mind, we've kind of made that distinction earlier about the supply side of the market and the demand side of the market. I think, KlimaDAO's position is that we're aligned with the existing standards. I think they've done incredible work to bring integrity to the market. It wouldn't have scaled to the point that it's at now without the standards, which is, Vero gold standard. You mentioned IETA and ICRO earlier. And that's the kind of platform that we're building on top of. So, and then if we go deeper into the article, there's two criticisms, right? There's the challenge on the quality of the credits, and then the challenge of the zombie credits. The notion of low quality credits itself isn't new. Not all carbon credits are created equal, I suppose, is the line you hear sometimes. That's why there's a spread in the market, why different customers purchase different types of credits and so on. I think that's quite a big discussion in its own right.
Sure. So for our listeners, what do we mean when we say zombie credit? It's saying like this is an old project that, had credits certified in the past, and then suddenly they're reissuing them. Is that what we mean by zombie? Or
yeah, I wouldn't say reissuing that, but issuing them for the first time, right? So the carbon credits will have a vintage date, which is the date that the mitigation or removal action kind of took place, and then it's got an issuance date, which is kind of the day the credit itself is issued and hits the market. So if you have very old credits with an old vintage, but a new issuance date, it implies that that the economics weren't right for that credit to be issued and put onto the market. And then the criticism is that now KlimaDAO has created the incentives to reissue those credits or to issue those credits. And there's a question around whether they should be a carbon credit or not, I suppose, is the ultimate challenge. If they've survived 8-10 years without being issued and without that carbon finance going to the project, well, maybe it's not additional. Maybe the project doesn't quote unquote deserve to be issued. Again, our position probably isn't that we need to challenge this point explicitly. In the case of us at the moment, the carbon credits that have been bridged onto the blockchain are Vera carbon credits. Vera have the position that these credits are legitimate and have a place within the market. So, I mean, should we be challenging that? I'm not sure. What we're seeing at the moment is this migration of the supply of carbon credits onto the blockchain. So to clarify, the migration of carbon credits onto the blockchain of carbon credits that haven't been, the offset hasn't been allocated to any organization or individual, right? They were previously live on the registry and traded using the registry, and now they're live on the blockchain to be traded on the blockchain. So by moving this legacy supply onto our sushi swap AMMs, we expose them to the DeFi market. And maybe I'm laboring this point a bit, but I think it's important that there's no allocation of an offset during this process. So to go deeper, I guess, we should probably look at the base carbon ton pool. So the base carbon ton pool is a pretty inclusive pool of carbon credits. If it's VCS certified and has a vintage post 2008, and the methodology hasn't explicitly been blacklisted by Toucan, which I mean a couple have, then it's fair game. So we're migrating these credits into the BCT pool. On one side, you've got Vera saying, fair game, these credits deserve to be issued, got a place in the market. And then on the other side, we've got these organizations saying, no, it's got no value. It doesn't deserve to be issued. So there's this, it's like almost a philosophical debate, right? And Klima itself is creating the incentives to do the migration. I don't think that necessarily even implicates us in the debate. We're saying it's a supply side issue, but we acknowledge the role of the supply side, and we want to expose the supply side to DeFi. So I think that's a fair position.
So we're incentivizing the migration of those credits in that sense, but we're not incentivizing the original certification or creation of them, right?
Right. It still ticks off the criteria to enable it to be issued. But I mean, I guess if we think more about the like, what can Klima do? What is Klima's role here, or what's Klima's influence here? There's one thing we can do to influence what supply of carbon credits come onto the blockchain, which is we can work with our bridging partners to inform the development of the gating criteria of the pools, right? So that's something we can do. As I mentioned, BCT is super broad. Basically, anything as long as it's not blacklisted can go in there. And actually, I think on the Toucan forum, they were discussing whether they should increase the stringency of BCT itself. So that's one way. So if we over time tweak the gating criteria for various pools, we already are selective with our bridging partners. We can start to influence what the supply on the market, on our markets actually is. And I think that's an interesting way for Klima to have influence here. But that said, going back to the point again, there's experts who have kind of defined the parameters around the issuance of carbon credits. So maybe we shouldn't challenge them, and I think that's going to be an ongoing kind of conversation and piece of exploration over the next years, months.
But I mean, like, Moss and C3 and Flow and some of our other partners who are bringing tokenized carbon on chain. So they have different standards and different cutoffs. And you're kind of alluding to the fact that that can be tweaked, or that's something that is within control.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is, if BCT was made more stringent, you would then cut off these zombie credits. And the challenge is that these zombie credits have no legitimate value. So, well, what if BCT got cut off and then we say, okay, well, let's test the hypothesis. We'll create a separate pool for these quote unquote zombie credits on a sushi swap AMM, and we'll let the market decide. We'll let the market find price equilibrium. And that would be an interesting experiment, right? To challenge, to say we're going to create a pool. Let's see if there's any demand for these credits. And I think, I don't say this to imply that Klima is even thinking about this. I think what I'm trying to do is just illustrate that Klima is like a demand side scaling solution for the carbon markets. So our approach is to leverage the DeFi tech stack to try and expose the market to a true efficient market. So if, taking this concept of zombie credits, I'm not saying we'll do it, but we could just stick them in the pool and then we could let the market define the price of them, that's the power of Klima, right? It's leveraging our incentives to kind of stratify the market, to put the carbon credits to productive use, to see if they do fetch a market price. And I'm sure they would. These zombie credits, they'll take a much lower premium, and I'm sure there's corporates that are interested in picking up some very low cost renewable credits to offset their carbon emissions. They're VCS certified. It fits into their reporting requirements. So why wouldn't they use them?
Well, certainly, as you're saying, we may or may not do that, but as a thought experiment, it certainly illustrates the role, and I think some of that benefit of bringing that carbon market on chain and setting up the liquidity there, right? I mean, this is not something. It's not a hypothesis that's easy to test off chain either, right?
Right, exactly. You can't really test it off chain because the fragmentation of the market and the lack of liquidity. It would be very difficult to test, and even if it got tested, it would be very unlikely that you'd be able to access the data to publicize the findings of the experiment. So, because everything's open on the blockchain, it would play out in front of everybody's eyes, which I think is, another compelling sort of benefit of what it is that we're building. It's super transparent.
Exactly. That's why I just thought was a little bit of a paradox or an oxymoron, I guess, about the way that article came out. It's kind of latching onto this, issue and a little bit of a narrow focus on that. But the whole, that debate or this issue or the way that we can solve it is kind of, addressable by the fact, or it's explorable by the fact that we've brought the carbon market on chain now, right? So much more.
Yeah, 100%. And that kind of goes back to the earlier point, right? If we keep, creating data, right, and using it to justify what it is that we're doing, we can hopefully start to cut through some of the more common attacks that we receive. I think, we've covered the idea of crypto carbon emissions, but another one that was kind of referenced in that the article that informed the Bloomberg article was that it kind of implied that solving climate change must not be rewarded. I can't remember the exact language that they used in that, but I think we should reject that notion that if an organization, a DAO, is innovative enough to try and embed some incentives into capturing carbon credits, creating demand for carbon credits, exposing carbon credits to new innovations. I don't think that's a good thing to do. And if there are economics and incentives that can be aligned with it, that's not something we should necessarily shy away from. It's, climate change should be a status symbol if you do something good. Climate change should be rewarded.
One of the things that bothers people in the greater community is the inability to contribute to take part in this climate action beyond making changes to their own lifestyle or advocating. many feel not empowered. And touching on what you were mentioning about the demand side, to kind of tie that in from maybe people who aren't as economically minded or aren't involved in markets, don't understand that lingo. When we talk about demand side, we're really talking about allowing people to engage with the market who want to. So what we're doing is allowing people to participate who may not have been able to participate in as meaningful a fashion in the past. I mean, both through just directly engaging with Klima or some aspect of the on-chain carbon ecosystem, or contributing directly to the success of it. I think that we're enabling climate activism, making it easier. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, it's a perhaps a more difficult part of this to quantify, but this idea of network effects is in crypto, and are we actually helping spread the word of climate change as well, or climate activism?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's an interesting question. It kind of, how we're enabling things kind of starts at the fundamental level, right? You used to have a registry account or pay for a broker for a service in order for you to acquire and retire a carbon credit. You don't need that anymore. You can just go purchase your credit on Polygon and retire it using KlimaDAO's retirement aggregator. So that's kind of step one, right? We've democratized access to the carbon market in a way that wasn't. And then I think from there, yeah, the openness kind of cascades down, right? Anyone can come and participate within Klima. They can acquire, so they can bond with the treasury, they can stake. And I think there's really interesting and creative things that we can do off the back of that. I like the analogy with the NFT space. I think a year ago we saw the kind of, as I mentioned earlier, that approach of offsetting per NFT, and what we see now with that really elegant CO2 compound piece that Archie and Sven worked on together. You can lock Klima within an NFT, make it irredeemable, and forever that NFT will compound carbon, and you won't be able to take that carbon out. It's not technically retired, right? It's custodied. But yeah, it just opens up all these new ways of thinking about things that we weren't able to before. I think another nice idea is this idea of using carbon as collateral, right? Before you couldn't ever use carbon as a collateral. I'm not sure what the bank would think if I asked for a loan, if I promised to hold some carbon credits on my registry account for them. But now with DeFi, you can take your tokenized carbon and you can offer it up and receive perhaps some Ethereum or a stable coin in return for it, and you can go off and you can do other productive activities, and you can come back and redeem your collateral if you need to. Or and I just think it opens up all these weird and wonderful solutions. And I think this is why what we're doing is quite interesting, right? I think crypto has been known for being almost a purely speculative activity. And I think, as I was talking about earlier, I think I initially got interested because I thought it had utility for the energy sector. And now we're seeing it's got these real benefits for the carbon markets. And I think, hopefully other people in crypto look at us and like our work, because we're demonstrating the value that it can bring to other areas of our lives that weren't previously. People didn't think there was necessarily a connection between crypto and a certain domain before.
So speaking about long time itself, right, it brings me to my favorite question, or the question that we always use to end the show, which is, what do you see in 2033?
I want to take this thing and get us recognized for the work that we're doing. I'd like us to not just be covered in media. That's not so. That is what it is. But to be acknowledged at the highest levels that what we're doing is meaningful, and it's closing that concept of an emissions gap. Right, at the moment we're not trending to where we need to trend if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So, I'd like to see us acknowledged as a legitimate solution. And I think, there's different ways that you can measure success at Klima. It can be liquidity, it can be the various things. But I think my favorite metric is the locked carbon credits in our treasury. I think that signifies the impact, right? So 2023, I can't comment on how many we'll have, but we're arguably on track to be on for 150 million, perhaps in the next year to 18 months. There's metrics that might suggest that. So, if we can keep up a good pace and internalize more and more carbon, we're doing the right thing. If we internalize more carbon, it, implicitly means that there'll be more Klima on the market. And with Klima, we can do interesting things, whether it's a lock test Klima and an NFT project, or, these other ideas we've kind of touched upon. So yeah, for me, I'm going to keep looking at that CO2 number.
Mm-hmm. I see. Really, really thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, keeping your eyes on the prize there, the key metric of the CO2 that we're bringing on chain. Yeah, I think that's probably a great way to wrap it up there too, unless there was anything else that you wanted to add or that we wanted to explore that we didn't.
No, I think that's great. Yeah, we covered a lot of content. Yeah, I mean, maybe there's one other idea we can touch on, but as this on-chain market kind of establishes itself, it'd be really interesting to see if we can incentivize, like DeFi native projects or new types of supply onto the blockchain. I know there's a lot of organizations who are thinking differently about the supply of carbon credits, and to date we've fallen back on that position that no, we kind of trust the main standards. But I think over time, particularly with carbon removals, where the question of carbon removals is typically a bit more of it's like a gap funding problem. Like if you're trying to fund innovation. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities for the on-chain carbon market to think differently about the supply. So it's something we should keep our eye on.
Boom. That's the mic drop.
Thank you very much, Oxy. This is really has been a really great session with you.
Cool. Cheers, guys. That was fun.
Well, that was definitely a great conversation. It was awesome to chat with Oxy and learn more about his background. I don't know about you two, but I really appreciated learning about, his background across both academia and renewables, and now how he's really, transitioned over the last few years and brought those skill sets over to our Web3 world. And, now he's really helping to tackle the climate crisis by driving innovation in the carbon markets with Klima here. How about you, Reg? What was your, takeaway, or what resonated with you with that conversation with Oxy?
I think in terms of weaving together the traditional carbon market with the developing blockchain carbon market, talking about the incentives and future vision, I think was really informative. And again, I think Klima, the community should be very, very proud to have someone of his caliber in the core team.
100%. I definitely, was impressed with this conversation. And for me, it was a first chance to hear from him, and would underscore your impressions there too. Diamond hands for you. What really stuck?
I think the most important thing is really like what he has in terms of vision and in terms of Klima itself. I think this is something that, through all the podcast episodes we have with the core team, is very, very much that they are all very aligned in the point where they're here for the long term, and they really see a lot of potential in Klima in changing and fighting climate change.
Yeah. I think that's definitely our mission here with the podcast, is letting people, meet the core team and really hear their motivation, their background, and get to meet them in this intimate way. So definitely agree with that there too. So for everything Klima, make sure you're hitting up klimadao.finance, where you can stake bond. And I think, most importantly, find that link to the Klima Discord community. That's under our resources tab, the resources section, and then you'll find a link to the Discord under community there. As a decentralized autonomous organization, Klima is community driven, just like this very podcast. So join us and you're going to find a great group of Klimates to connect with and plenty of opportunities to contribute and be an active Klimate too. So we hope you enjoyed this conversation with Oxymoron, and thank you so much for joining us. We're looking forward to connecting with you and saying hello once again on the very next Planet of the Klimates.